After years talking to doctors, neuroscientists, and sleep specialists, I discovered something surprising. Most people think sleep is simply about spending 8 hours in bed. But the more I dug into this, the clearer it became that the quality of your sleep is decided by choices you make long before you ever close your eyes. By the time you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why tonight feels different from last night, the outcome has already, in a very real sense, been written. Not entirely, but far more than almost anyone realizes. I want to take you through everything I learned, because it completely rearranged how I think about one of the most basic things a human being does, something we spend roughly a third of our entire life engaged in, and something almost none of us were ever properly taught how to do well. I used to think about sleep the way most people do, as a kind of passive shutdown, a period where the body simply switches off and waits for morning. What I learned, across dozens of conversations with people who study this for a living, is that sleep is one of the most active, structured, and precisely engineered processes the human body performs. And the quality of that process is shaped by an enormous number of small decisions scattered across your entire day, most of which have nothing to do with your bedroom at all. I want to give this the full hour it deserves, because there's a lot here, and I think every single piece of it is worth actually understanding rather than skimming. Let me start with a thing that actually reframed the whole subject for me, because I think it's the single most important idea in everything I learned. Sleep isn't one uniform state. It isn't 8 hours of the same thing happening over and over. It's a cycle, repeating roughly every 90 minutes across the night, moving through distinct stages, each doing a completely different job for your brain and body. There's light sleep, which acts as the transition in and out of deeper states. There's deep sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, which is when your body does the majority of its physical repair, tissue growth, muscle recovery, immune system reinforcement. And there's REM sleep, the stage most associated with dreaming, which multiple neuroscientists describe to me as being just as critical for the brain as deep sleep is for the body, involved in emotional processing, memory consolidation, and a kind of overnight editing process where the brain decides what from your day gets filed away as important and what gets quietly discarded. Here's the part that surprised me the most. These stages aren't evenly distributed across the night. Deep sleep is heavily concentrated in the first half of the night, while REM sleep becomes more dominant in the second half, closer to morning, which means the actual timing and structure of your sleep matters just as much as the total number of hours, because two people can both sleep exactly 8 hours and end up with wildly different amounts of deep repair and dream stage processing, depending on when their sleep happened and how it was disrupted along the way. That single fact is the reason so many people do everything, right on paper, 8 hours, a consistent bedtime, and still wake up feeling like they barely slept at all. They're hitting the duration target while missing the structure entirely. And once I understood that, I started asking a different question in every conversation after that. Not how many hours should someone sleep, but what determines whether someone actually gets the deep sleep and REM sleep they need inside whatever hours they do get. And that question is what led me to the pattern I want to walk you through now, because almost everything that determines the answer happens hours, sometimes an entire day, before you ever get into bed. The first decision, and the one that came up in nearly every single conversation, was about light, specifically morning light. Several sleep scientists describe the same mechanism to me in almost identical terms. Your body runs on an internal clock, a roughly 24-hour cycle called the circadian rhythm, and that clock is set primarily by exposure to bright light, especially natural sunlight, in the hours after you wake up. Getting a meaningful amount of bright light exposure within the first hour or two of waking does something that sounds almost too simple to matter this much. It tells your brain precisely when the day started, which in turn sets a countdown, roughly 14 to 16 hours later, for when your body should naturally begin producing the hormone that makes you sleepy at night. Skip that morning light, spend your first hour indoors under dim artificial lighting, and that internal clock drifts, becomes less precise, and the natural release of that sleep-inducing hormone in the evening becomes later and weaker than it would otherwise be. Multiple researchers told me this single habit, morning light exposure, is one of the most underrated levers available to almost anyone, and one of the least talked about compared to all the evening routines people obsess over. You're trying to fix a nighttime problem, and the actual lever is sitting there unused first thing in the morning. The second decision was about caffeine, and I want to walk through this one carefully because what I learned genuinely changed how I personally think about my own mornings. Almost everyone knows caffeine keeps you awake, but very few people understand exactly how long it actually stays active in the body. Caffeine has what's called a half-life of roughly 5 to 6 hours in an average adult, which means if you have a coffee at 2 in the afternoon, by 8 that evening, roughly half of that caffeine is still circulating in your system, and a meaningful amount is still present even later than that. Several sleep specialists were emphatic about this specific point. Even if you don't feel obviously wired before bed, caffeine still active in your system at night reduces the amount of deep sleep you get, even in people who insist they can fall asleep fine after an evening coffee. Falling asleep and sleeping deeply are two completely different things, and caffeine can leave the first one intact while quietly sabotaging the second one, which is exactly why so many people don't connect their afternoon coffee to how groggy they feel the next morning. The recommendation that came up again and again wasn't necessarily to eliminate caffeine, but to respect its actual duration, cutting it off somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 hours before your intended bedtime, rather than the much shorter window most people assume is safe. The third decision, and this one genuinely surprised me because of how differently it's usually talked about publicly, was about alcohol. There's a very common belief that a drink or two in the evening helps you sleep, and in a narrow sense, that's true. Alcohol is a sedative, and it can make you fall asleep faster. But nearly every sleep researcher I spoke with described this as one of the most misleading effects in the entire subject, because alcohol dramatically disrupts sleep architecture later in the night, specifically suppressing REM sleep in the first half of the night, and then producing a rebound effect in the second half that leads to fragmented, shallower sleep and frequent, often unremembered, awakenings. People wake up the next morning feeling unrested, blame it on just not sleeping well, and rarely connect it back to the wine they had with dinner, because the disruption happens hours after they've already fallen asleep, invisible to their own memory of the night. Several specialists described alcohol as one of the most under-recognized sleep disruptors precisely because of this delayed, hidden mechanism, compared to something like caffeine, which people tend to correctly blame when it keeps them awake. The fourth decision was about temperature, and this is one of the more mechanical, almost engineering-like facts I learned. Your core body temperature needs to drop by a small but specific amount in order to properly initiate and maintain deep sleep, and that temperature drop is one of the actual biological triggers your body uses to move into and stay in its deepest sleep stages. A bedroom that's too warm interferes directly with that mechanism, regardless of how tired you feel or how good your mattress is. Multiple specialists recommended a bedroom temperature meaningfully cooler than what most people keep their homes at, and pointed out that a hot shower or bath an hour or two before bed can actually help, not by warming you up right before sleep, but by causing a rebound cooling effect afterward that helps trigger exactly the temperature drop your body is looking for. It's a small detail, but it's one more example of the larger pattern, an intervention that works because of what happens to your body an hour or two before bed, not because of anything you do once you're already lying down. The fifth decision, and I think this might be the one most people have never even considered, was about consistency, specifically the regularity of your wake time more than your bedtime. Several researchers pushed back directly against the common advice to simply go to bed earlier, pointing out that an irregular sleep schedule, even one that technically averages 8 hours a night, produces something close to a mild, chronic version of jet lag because your circadian rhythm relies on predictability to stay properly calibrated. Waking up at wildly different times on weekdays versus weekends, sometimes described as social jet lag, was described to me by more than one specialist as one of the most common, least discussed causes of persistent daytime tiredness in otherwise healthy adults. The body doesn't just want 8 hours. It wants those 8 hours to arrive at roughly the same time, night after night, because the internal clock regulating your sleep hormones is tuned to a rhythm, not just a quota. The sixth decision was about the hour before bed specifically, but not in the way most people assume when they hear the phrase wind down routine. The common advice is almost entirely about screens and blue light, and while several specialists acknowledge that bright light, including light from phones and laptops, can suppress the release of your evening sleep hormone to some degree, nearly all of them said the bigger issue with screens in the final hour before bed isn't the light itself, it's the content. Scrolling through emotionally charged news, work messages, or an engaging show keeps your nervous system in an alert, activated state, which is far harder to switch off than a simple light exposure issue. Several specialists described the ideal pre-sleep window not primarily in terms of banning technology, but in terms of deliberately lowering psychological and emotional arousal, whatever method actually achieves that for a given person. Reading something calm, a short journaling practice, a few minutes of slow breathing, a conversation with a partner about something unrelated to stress. The mechanism that matters is the nervous system settling from an alert state into a calmer one, and screens are simply one of the most common ways that settling gets accidentally prevented, not because of the light, but because of what's actually happening on the other side of the glass. The seventh decision was about exercise, and the nuance here surprised me too. Regular physical activity was described, without exception, as one of the most powerful tools available for improving sleep quality overall, particularly for increasing the amount of deep sleep someone gets. But the timing matters. Intense exercise very close to bedtime raises core body temperature and stimulates the nervous system in ways that can work directly against the cooling and calming process your body needs in order to fall into deep sleep efficiently. Most specialists suggested finishing more vigorous exercise at least a few hours before bed, while pointing out that gentle movement, a slow walk, light stretching, closer to bedtime doesn't carry the same disruptive effect and can actually help with the wind-down process described above. The eighth decision, which came up more than I expected once I started specifically asking about it, was about food, and specifically the timing of your last meal. Several specialists described eating a large meal too close to bedtime as a significant, underappreciated disruptor, because digestion raises core body temperature and metabolic activity at exactly the moment your body is trying to cool down and slow down for sleep. A heavy meal within an hour or two of bed was consistently described as working against the same temperature mechanism I mentioned earlier, on top of increasing the likelihood of physical discomfort or reflux disturbing sleep later in the night. On the other end of the spectrum, going to bed genuinely hungry was also flagged as disruptive, since falling blood sugar overnight can trigger a stress hormone response that fragments sleep in its own way. The consistent guidance was to aim for your last substantial meal roughly 2 to 3 hours before bed, leaving enough time for digestion to settle before your body needs to begin its own cooling and calming process. The ninth decision was about stress hormones, specifically cortisol, and how it interacts with the entire system I've been describing. Cortisol naturally follows its own daily rhythm, rising sharply in the morning to help you wake up and feel alert, then gradually declining across the day, reaching its lowest point in the evening to allow your body to properly wind down. Several specialists pointed out that chronic daytime stress, the kind many of us live with almost constantly without noticing it as unusual anymore, can flatten this natural rhythm, keeping cortisol elevated later into the evening than it should be, directly competing with the release of the hormones your body needs in order to fall properly asleep. This is part of why a demanding high-pressure day can leave someone feeling simultaneously exhausted and unable to switch off at night. Two states that seem contradictory but are actually both symptoms of the exact same disrupted hormonal rhythm. The 10th decision, and one I hadn't expected to come up so often, was about naps. The research here was more nuanced than the simple naps are good or naps are bad framing usually presented. Several specialists described short naps, generally somewhere under 30 minutes, taken earlier in the day as genuinely restorative and largely harmless to nighttime sleep for most people. But longer naps, or naps taken later in the afternoon, were consistently flagged as reducing what's called sleep pressure, the natural, steadily building drive to sleep that accumulates the longer you've been awake, which can make it noticeably harder to fall asleep at your normal bedtime and can shift your entire schedule later than intended. The guidance that came up again and again was to keep naps short and early if you need them, and to be honest with yourself about whether an afternoon nap is genuinely restorative or simply a symptom of poor nighttime sleep that would be better addressed at its actual source. I want to bring all 10 of these together now, because I think the pattern underneath them is more important than any single one of them on its own. Every single lever I've just described operates hours, sometimes an entire day, before the moment you actually try to fall asleep. Morning light sets your clock for the entire day. Afternoon caffeine, still active that night regardless of how you feel. Evening alcohol, disrupting architecture hours after you've already fallen asleep. Bedroom temperature, working through a mechanism triggered well before you're unconscious. Wake time consistency, a cumulative effect built up across days and weeks, not a single night. Pre-bed psychological arousal, shaped by what you do in the hour before, not the moment you lie down. Exercise timing, working through effects that take hours to fully settle. Meal timing, competing directly with your body's cooling process. Daytime stress, flattening a hormonal rhythm that's supposed to decline naturally by evening. And naps, quietly borrowing against the very sleep pressure your body needs that night. Sleep, in other words, isn't something that happens to you for 8 hours starting at bedtime. It's the final output of a whole day's worth of decisions, most of which have nothing to do with your bedroom, your mattress, or your nighttime routine at all, and almost everything to do with choices made from the moment you wake up until the moment you finally lie down. I remember one conversation in particular that made this click for me, in a way none of the individual facts had on their own. I was speaking with a sleep physician who works with patients who insist, genuinely, that they simply can't sleep, despite spending a full 8 or 9 hours in bed every single night. And what this specialist described was a consistent pattern across almost every one of these patients. They were treating sleep as a single event, something you either succeed or fail at during the hours you're in bed, when in reality their actual problem was scattered across their entire day. Coffee at 3 in the afternoon, no real morning light exposure because they worked from a dim home office and didn't step outside until lunch, a glass of wine most evenings that they genuinely believed was helping, a bedroom kept warm because that's what felt cozy, a late, heavy dinner eaten in front of the television, an hour before bed spent scrolling through work email while telling themselves they were relaxing. None of these people were doing anything unusual. This specialist described it as close to the default pattern of modern life, and said that in a huge number of cases, simply walking a patient through these 10 decisions, one at a time, and helping them adjust even 4 or 5 of them, produced a bigger improvement in how rested they felt than anything achievable through medication. That last point is one I want to sit with for a moment, because several of the physicians I spoke with were remarkably candid about their discomfort with how quickly sleep medication gets reached for, both by doctors and by patients themselves, before these more foundational, unglamorous factors have even been examined. Sleep aids, they explained, can genuinely help someone fall asleep faster, but several specialists pointed out that many of these medications actually reduce the amount of deep sleep and REM sleep a person gets, even while technically keeping them unconscious for the same number of hours. In other words, some of the most commonly reached for tools for a sleep problem may be solving the most visible symptom, difficulty falling asleep, while quietly making the deeper, less visible problem, poor sleep architecture, slightly worse. That's not medical advice, and nobody I spoke with suggested people should simply stop medication they've been prescribed without talking to their own doctor. But several were emphatic that the 10 daily decisions I've just described deserve to be tried first, seriously and consistently, before reaching for something designed primarily to address the symptom of wakefulness rather than the underlying architecture of the sleep itself. I also want to mention something that came up specifically when I asked about individual variation, because I think it's an important nuance. Several researchers pointed out that people have genuinely different natural chronotypes, an internal tendency toward being more of a morning person or more of an evening person, largely shaped by genetics rather than simple discipline or laziness. What this means practically is that the exact clock times that work well for one person won't necessarily work identically for another. And part of the 10 decisions I've described is about consistency and structure relative to your own natural rhythm, not about forcing everyone into an identical schedule. Someone with a genuinely later chronotype fighting constantly to wake up at 5 in the morning because that's what a productivity routine recommended may be, working directly against their own biology in a way that undermines several of the other levers I've described, no matter how disciplined they are about everything else. I want to talk for a moment about why this actually matters beyond simply feeling more rested, because I think the stakes here are genuinely underappreciated. Deep sleep isn't just about feeling refreshed. Several neuroscientists described it as one of the primary windows the brain has for clearing out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours, including proteins that, when allowed to build up over years of poor sleep, are associated with long-term cognitive decline. REM sleep, meanwhile, was described as playing a critical role in emotional regulation, with several researchers pointing to studies showing that a single night of REM-deprived sleep measurably increases emotional reactivity the following day. making ordinary frustrations feel more intense and harder to manage. Put those two things together, and you start to see why chronic poor sleep architecture, even in someone technically getting 8 hours a night, has been linked by researchers to elevated risks across an enormous range of outcomes, from mood and anxiety to long-term metabolic and cognitive health. This isn't a minor lifestyle optimization. Several of the people I spoke with described sleep quality as one of the single most underrated levers in all of health, more foundational, in their view, than almost anything people spend far more time and money obsessing over. I also want to mention something that came up repeatedly and that I think deserves real attention: the emotional relationship many people have with their own sleep, specifically anxiety about sleep itself. Several specialists described a pattern where someone has one bad night, becomes anxious about repeating it, and that anxiety about falling asleep becomes its own independent obstacle to falling asleep, creating a cycle that has nothing to do with any of the 10 decisions I've described and everything to do with the nervous system, treating the bed itself as a source of stress rather than safety. If this sounds familiar to you, it's worth knowing that this specific pattern, sometimes described clinically as conditioned arousal around sleep, is well recognized and is generally addressed not through willpower or trying harder to relax, but through consistent behavioral changes over time, ideally with the guidance of a specialist rather than through sheer determination alone. One more thing worth mentioning, because it came up in almost every conversation with someone who works with patients directly: the growing popularity of sleep tracking devices. Several specialists had genuinely mixed feelings here. On one hand, these devices have made a huge number of people aware, for the first time, that sleep has structure at all, that there's such a thing as deep sleep and REM sleep worth paying attention to, rather than treating sleep as one undifferentiated block of unconsciousness. On the other hand, several specialists described a specific pattern they now see regularly, where someone becomes so anxious about their tracked sleep score that the anxiety itself starts interfering with their actual sleep, which is precisely the conditioned arousal problem I just described, except now with a number attached to it every single morning. The advice that came up most consistently was to treat these tools as a rough general guide to trends over weeks, not as a nightly verdict to be stressed about, since the accuracy of consumer devices in measuring specific sleep stages is still, according to several researchers, considerably less precise than most people assume. So let me turn this into something practical, because I don't want to leave you with a pile of facts and no clear way to actually use them. Here is what I've come to believe, after everything I've learnt, about how to actually improve your own sleep, starting with the decisions that happen long before your head hits the pillow. First, get outside, or at least near a bright window, within the first hour or two of waking up, for at least 10 to 15 minutes, if you can manage it. This single habit does more to anchor your body's internal clock than almost anything you could do in the evening, and it's the one lever most people have never even considered adjusting. Second, know your own caffeine cutoff and respect it. Seriously, not casually. Work backward from your intended bedtime by roughly 8 to 10 hours and treat that as a genuine boundary, especially if you already suspect your sleep quality, not just your ability to fall asleep, might be an issue. Third, reconsider the evening drink, at least as an experiment. If you already believe alcohol helps you sleep, try a stretch of several nights without it and pay attention not to how quickly you fall asleep, but to how you feel the next morning, and how many times you notice yourself waking briefly during the night. Fourth, cool your bedroom down more than probably feels intuitively comfortable, and consider a warm shower an hour or so before bed if you struggle to fall into deep sleep, rather than relying purely on room temperature alone. Fifth, protect your wake time above almost everything else, including on weekends. If you can only fix one piece of consistency, make it the time you get up, not the time you go to bed, since that single anchor point does the most to keep your internal rhythm properly calibrated across the entire week. Sixth, redesign the final hour before bed around lowering your nervous system's arousal, not simply around banning your phone. If you scroll, notice what you're scrolling through, and steer deliberately away from anything emotionally charged, work-related, or conflict-inducing, replacing it with something calmer, whatever that looks like for you specifically. Seventh, keep moving your body regularly, and if you exercise intensely, try to finish a few hours before bed rather than right up against it. saving anything more vigorous for earlier in the day and reserving gentle movement for closer to bedtime if you want to move at all in that window. Eighth, give your last substantial meal a couple of hours of breathing room before bed, avoiding both a heavy meal right before sleep and going to bed genuinely hungry, since both ends of that spectrum work against the same underlying mechanisms. Ninth, pay attention to how you're managing stress across the actual day, not just in the moments right before bed, since a cortisol rhythm that stays elevated into the evening because of unmanaged daytime stress will quietly undermine almost every other change you make. 10th, if you nap, keep it short and early, and get honest with yourself about whether it's genuinely restorative or a symptom of a nighttime problem that would be better solved at its actual source. And 11th, if you've tried adjusting these decisions seriously and consistently, and you're still struggling, treat that as a genuine signal to talk to a doctor or a sleep specialist, rather than simply reaching for something over the counter on your own, or trusting a tracking device's nightly score more than how you actually feel. Persistent sleep difficulty, several specialists were clear, is worth investigating properly rather than quietly living with indefinitely, because of how much of the rest of your health, physical and mental, is quietly built on top of it. I want to end with something one of the neuroscientists said to me, almost as a closing thought, that has genuinely changed how I think about my own evenings since. She said, we treat sleep like it's something that happens to us passively at the end of a long day, almost as an afterthought to everything we consider the real parts of our life, the work, the relationships, the ambitions. But she said, if you actually look at what the body is doing during those 8 hours, repairing tissue, clearing waste from the brain, processing the entire emotional weight of the previous day, consolidating everything worth remembering, it becomes hard to defend the idea that sleep is the passive part of your life at all. If anything, she said, it might be the most active, most essential work your entire body does every single day, and the only reason it feels passive is that you're unconscious for it. Everything I've described tonight, in the end, comes down to a single idea worth carrying with you. You don't fall asleep well. You arrive at sleep well, or you arrive at it poorly, based on a long trail of small decisions made across the entire day, and the version of you lying in bed each night is simply collecting on choices that were made hours, sometimes an entire day, before you ever closed your eyes.